was told to me was by my little grandma. She was a small woman, about 4 foot tall, always wearing an apron with a can of snuff in the pocket. She said it was medicine. Of course, when you saw her spit, you knew it wasn't medicine.
Grandma and Grandpa Charlie decided to go to Oklahoma in the 1900s.
Grandma and Grandpa Charlie decided to go to Oklahoma in the 1900s. They left Kirksville in a covered wagon. They had everything they owned in it. They stopped about every other day to hunt. It took them 2 months to travel to Oklahoma. Along the way, Grandma and Grandpa settled in Indian Territory, a place called Stillwell. Grandma started to learn medicine from the Indians, and they traded with the Indians for different items, squash and corn. Little Grandma carried a small buffalo horn around her neck with medicine in it.
Grandpa Charlie was a great provider for his family. On their travels to Oklahoma,
Grandpa Charlie was a great provider for his family. On their travels to Oklahoma, Grandpa shot 2 buffaloes. They traded with other people along the way for different foods.
They dried and salted most of the meat and fish they caught. So cooking was often
a process of making these foods edible, and if lucky, palatable as well.
Meat would be prepared by frying, boiling, roasting,
and when in a hurry during starving times, it might have been eaten raw.
Grandma mentioned that she had heard of other settlers eating such things as moccasins, saddles, and rawhide straps during starving times. The bread they would have eaten were biscuits, flapjacks, fry bread, cornbread, and hardtack. Things did not go well. It did not turn out to be the promised land, so they returned to Joplin, Missouri. Grandpa Charlie got a job promised to him back in Kirksville, so he took the train to Kirksville, and Grandma and her dad were left to bring the wagon and animals home. Common vegetables they carried with them were dried beans, hominies, and peas. Things she mentioned was portions of the intestine of the buffalo were filled with wild onions and other herbs and spices, tied off and roasted until sizzling. She said it was important to eat other organ meats such as liver, which provided vitamins and nutrients otherwise lacking in the diet. Feasting on bear liver, heart, and kidney basted with fat
was a dish they liked. Grandma said dog was generally not eaten by people during starving times. However, the Indians considered a dog a delicacy, and invariably dog found a high place in the menu of the feast and celebrations. If a trader or a trapper was invited to such a feast, he would be expected to partake of the dog.
Pemmican is made with a combination of dried meat, dried fruit,
and rendered grease. The dried meat and fruit are pounded into a very fine meal. Just enough hot grease is poured over the mixture of the meat and fruit to moisten it. Then the mixture is packed into skin sacks and bladders. They carry it with them when they travel.
Beaver tail could be as large as 12 to 15 inches long, 4 inches wide, and
Beaver tail could be as large as 12 to 15 inches long, 4 inches wide, and a ½ inch thick. Cut into strips and broiled, it was said to resemble bacon.
Grandma said if they ran low on potatoes, they would gather prairie potatoes, which is a tuber almost the size of a common potato. When cooked, it's dry and sweet tasting. This may be arrowhead, which was once an important food source from the Indians. When the coffee would get low, they extended or substituted with roasted chicory. Red root, also known as New Jersey tea, a bush highly esteemed as a tea substitute. When Dad was young, he quit school and decided to help support his family. He traveled from town to town looking for work. His many travels in Missouri was by train. I guess you could say my dad at one time was a hobo. I'm sure That is how Dad learned what to eat from his life as a hobo. Dad later joined the Army and became a butcher and a cook.
We went bass fishing in Missouri. Dad would shoot the red-winged blackbirds.
We went bass fishing in Missouri. Dad would shoot the red-winged blackbirds. He would take the breast out, which we would eat later, and the rest was used for fishing.
Dad did hand fishing in the Missouri River. I wouldn't do that.
Dad did hand fishing in the Missouri River. I wouldn't do that. He would wade into the water, reach back into the banks and the holes, and feel for the fish, grab, hold, and pull them out.
Dad took me squirrel hunting one year, and the squirrel was headed back into the nest.
Dad took me squirrel hunting one year, and the squirrel was headed back into the nest. Dad shot it as it traveled into the nest. He killed it and had to climb the tree to get the baby squirrel, and told me how wrong it was for what he had done. In the meantime, we had a baby squirrel to raise, and it didn't make Mom any too happy.
We went pheasant hunting one year, but came upon prairie chickens.
We went pheasant hunting one year, but came upon prairie chickens. We did not shoot them. They were strutting around, puffing out their orange chests. What a sight to see. We just stopped to watch them. Something I'll never forget. I thought they were throwing up their guts. Dad just laughed and said, "That's the way they call their mates."
Wherever we lived, we kept animals, pigs, sheep, chickens.
Wherever we lived, we kept animals, pigs, sheep, chickens, cattle. With me being the smallest, I got to do the milking. I got to strip the cows. Dad didn't like this job. He said his hands were too big to do it. It was just an excuse, so he didn't have to do it. I stripped about 30 cows twice a day.
Mom would make cottage cheese. It was the dry type, but it was good.
Mom would make cottage cheese. It was the dry type, but it was good. She would always add large amounts of thick, fresh cream to her cottage cheese. I'd love to have some of it right now.
I got a chance to make butter when I was young. I thought it was great.
I got a chance to make butter when I was young.
At Grandma's,
I thought it was great till I had to do it all the time. At Grandma's, I got to sit underneath the big maple tree with the churn. There were two kinds of churn, the paddle and the crank. The paddle was the one I always made a mess with, up and down. Too fast the milk went everywhere, too slow, no butter for a long time. Grandma would take the butter, salt it, and put it in those little ceramic or wooden molds and let it set up.
We lived in a place called Carr, Missouri. Dad had planted a lot of corn because
we lived in a place called Carr, Missouri. Dad had planted a lot of corn because we raised a lot of hogs.
When we harvest the corn, some of the corn went to the corn crib.
When we harvest the corn, some of the corn went to the corn crib, and some we would hand shuck. We would parch some to eat, and Dad loved hominy, so we made that, and Mom canned it. We would sit for hours and hours and shuck corn so Dad could take it to the grist mill. Dad and Uncle Bernard started planting sorghum. They would cut the stalks, save some seed for next year's crop, some seed for the chickens. Then they took it to the mill where it was processed. People got wind that Dad and Uncle Bernard were making sorghum. It was the best, thick, irony, dark sorghum we had. They sold many pints and quarts. Dad and I did a lot of hunting in every state we lived. Ohio, we hunted rabbits, birds, and we did fishing. On Sunday, Dad would take Mom and me fishing on Lake Erie. We would fish most of the day. We would catch pike, perch, muskie, any fish, it didn't matter. We took them home. We would have them to eat most of the week, but we froze some. In the fall, Dad would take me rabbit hunting. He had an old beagle named Jiggs, best hunting dog we ever had. Jiggs would hunt them, Dad would shoot them, and I would retrieve them. Funny how that worked. We would get our allotted amount and head back for home. One year someone stole Jiggs. He was only 4 blocks away, and I found him in an old man's pen. I told Dad, and he went down and stole Jiggs back. That man never came around anymore. Mom canned most of the rabbit we got so we could have it during the winter months. Dad would always find a way to stretch the meat. He would fry some, stew some, and then he'd take the stew and make pot pies. We'd usually get 3 or 4 meals out of one mess of meat. Sometimes I didn't like it, but you just ate it and shut up.
Dad would take the furs of the animals, tan them, and sell them for extra cash for the winter.
Dad would take the furs of the animals, tan them, and sell them for extra cash for the winter months.
Some of the best morel mushroom hunting was in Ohio and Missouri.
Some of the best morel mushroom hunting was in Ohio and Missouri. We could pick forever back then. While we were picking mushrooms, Dad would usually get greens too.
The ones I was allowed to pick was poke, dandelion, plantain, cress mustard.
The ones I was allowed to pick was poke, dandelion, plantain, cress mustard, and carpenter square. He said they were easy for me to find and remember. Dad would clean them and fry them with some salty bacon. If we didn't have enough greens, he would add spinach and eggs. We also picked ramps or wild leeks. The name depended on what part of the country you lived in.
Mom liked them best with eggs and fried potatoes. Dad didn't care for them much.
Mom liked them best with eggs and fried potatoes. Dad didn't care for them much, but he told us just to eat them because they were good for us. People used to make fun of us because we reeked in the smell of ramps.
During the summer months, we picked berries and fruit. Dad loved to make wine.
During the summer months, we picked berries and fruit. Dad loved to make wine. He had these big jugs, and we had no basement to make the wine in. So Dad decided to put the wine in the closet to ferment. The lids were on too tight, and in a couple of weeks, it exploded. The wine went all over his clothes and shoes. Mom was so mad.
Mom canned the berries and fruit. She made fruit leather, jellies, and jams.
Mom canned the berries and fruits. She made fruit leather, jellies, and jams. We picked wild strawberries. I got most of that job. I guess it was because I was closer to the ground.
May apples when we could, but it was hard because the wild animals ate most of them.
We would pick May apples when we could, but it was hard because the wild animals ate most of them. I don't remember ever eating a May apple.
When we lived in Georgetown, West Virginia, we had a big orchard up on the hill behind the
When we lived in Georgetown, West Virginia, we had a big orchard up on the hill behind the farmhouse. We picked all the fruit for the winter off this orchard. I think Grandpa planted every tree he could think of. But on the way to the orchard, you had to pass the sassafras patch. My Uncle Frank always dug the sassafras. He was a funny man. Always had a pack of juicy fruit gum for all of us kids.
Uncle Frank would hike up the hill to dig the root.
Anyway, Uncle Frank would hike up the hill to dig the root. He always got the best. It was our spring tonic. He would bring it down off the hill. Grandma would wash it and clean it, boil it to the strength she liked, and we would all have it in a big cup.
We always had a big garden, so we didn't do many harvesting of wild vegetables.
We always had a big garden, so we didn't do many harvesting of wild vegetables, but we did everything else. I would have to say we hunted most of our meat. Back then, I know there were still hunting regulations, but if we got hungry, Dad would just go out and shoot what we were going to eat that night. Sometimes the pickings were slim, but he always stretched it to make enough for all.
We moved out of Grandma and Grandpa's house to the large farmhouse around the hill.
When we moved out of Grandma and Grandpa's house to the large farmhouse around the hill, Dad wanted to go berry picking. Great. Just what I wanted. Hot, bugs, briars. Well, there was no way fighting with Dad. You just got up and went. We headed out and got to the patch. The berries were as big as your thumb, plump and sweet. We picked about an hour and got 6 buckets full. We canned jellies and pies. Yum! In the fall, it was nut season. Grandma Linger had the best hickory nut tree. She wouldn't allow anybody to pick any of the nuts. She would send us kids down to gather them. They were big and easy to shell. That's why she wouldn't let anybody have any.
Walnut, hazelnut, chestnut.
We had butternut trees, walnut, hazelnut, and chestnut. The walnut we would take to the barn and lay out for the shells to rot off. Grandpa would keep some and put in the barrel to collect the black dye off of the shells to stain the wood for his sawmill. Grandpa had his own sawmill for years till he got his arm cut off in the mill. He learned how to work the mill even after he lost his arm. After the nuts dried out in the wintertime, we would sit around and crack out the nut meat. Then Aunt Madge would make cakes, pies, candy. My favorite was the hickory nut fudge. On Saturday, Aunt Madge would get ready to make homemade bread. She'd get 10 pounds of flour, cake, yeast, milk, water, and on the big clean table, she would start. She never got in trouble for making a mess on it. She made bread for everyone in the family, loaves and buns, in and out of the oven. They would come and go. You could smell the fresh bread smell coming from inside the house. Dad would start a big pot of soup. Anything and everything went into it. That evening, the family would come in and eat soup and hot bread and homemade butter. They'd pick up their fresh bread for the week, and Aunt Madge made more money for more supplies. Grandma Linger had a patch of gooseberries and kerns. No one liked to pick them because of the snakes. Well, my cousin Alan and I got the job. He liked bugs and snakes and anything wild. So if there was a snake, he caught it and took it somewhere else. He was another one of the family members who started to learn about wild plants and foods. One year, he decided to make dandelion wine. He stole the sugar from Grandma and got a big jug to put the dandelion flowers, sugar, and water in. We hid it in the corn crib and left it there for what seemed like years. Alan got it out, opened it up. We all took turns tasting it. Boy, was it awful. I had an Uncle Forrest that lived up the holler from where we lived. When you would go to their house any day of the week, you would find the roof of their sheds covered with wild berries and dried vegetables. Uncle Stewart and Aunt Helen, they lived upon the hill behind Grandma's house. They were the real hill folk of our family. They gathered everything they could survive on the year. They had a wood stove for cooking and heating. Uncle Stewart could take any scrap of metal and make some of the most beautiful knives and utensils out of them. They hunted all their meat, hung the meat in the smokehouse, and salted it. They tanned the hides and sold them for cash to buy staples for the family. They canned everything they could get their hands on. They had the best wild plum and persimmons. They would pick the fruit, and Aunt Helen would make jellies and jams to sell. Aunt Helen would never tell us where the trees were. We looked forward to her jellies and jams every year. Uncle Ab was a giant of a man. He had bees, cattle, and chickens. Uncle Ab was a giant of a man. He had bees, cattle, and chickens. He kept his bees in the old cone hives. He gathered the honey and would keep most of it, but did sell some. Uncle Ab refused to change the time on his clock from winter to summer. He always said the cows and chickens didn't know that the time changed. I would go to his house in the morning and every evening to help milk his cows. Aunt Eddie, who was Uncle Ab's wife, made the best ginger snap cookies I ever ate. Their house was heated by 2 fireplaces, one in the dining area and one close to the bedroom. I remember she used to cook over the open fireplace during the winter, and in the summer she used a wood cook stove. What a wonderful woman. My dear Grandma Duncan, what a wonderful woman. She was a small woman, about 4'2". She wore her hair tied up with a scarf on it. She always wore an apron with a pocket in the front, and she carried a small derringer in the pocket. She said you never know when those gypsies would come along. She lived through the Great Dust Bowl out west in the Depression. She explained they did not have much to eat during that time. She talked about the dust storms and how you could not see anything in front of you when you were walking outside, when the storms would blow in. She said they ate a lot of whatever their mom had canned, but when times got rough, they moved back to West Virginia. She got a job on the railroad as a pastry chef. That's where she met her husband. Duncan never had any children because her husband bled to death when he had some teeth pulled, as she says, in the wrong sign of the moon. She believed in planting and harvesting by the signs of the moon. Then she went to work for the post office. She delivered mail with a horse and buggy. She would tell me of the time when her horse got the snots, as she called it. She got a bucket and put a hornet's nest in it, caught it on fire, blew it out, and put it under the horse's nose so the smoke could go up its nostrils. She said in a couple days that horse was better. She did all kinds of treatments like this. Every spring she would call me to come over and help her gather wild greens. She would collect comfrey and make tea out of it for her kidneys. She would pick it and tie it and let it dry for the winter. She collected dandelion, poke, plantain, and cress. She would take the fresh dandelion, chew on it, and place it on burns. She would cover it with a clean white cloth, and in a couple days it would heal. Duncan grew a lot of medicinal plants. She didn't go much to the doctor. We would go out and pick wild grapes. She would can them with just sugar and water. We would go out and pick wild grapes. She would can them with just sugar and water. She said if you left the jars for a couple years, it would turn into wine. Never got to try any of that. She taught me how to make my first grape pie. I thought she was pulling my leg, but nope, it's one of my favorite pies. Her basement was full of canned goods. She said she would never be hungry again after living through the Dust Bowl and the Depression. She taught me how to use everything, never throw anything away.
Most favorite thing for her was spring. In the garden,
I think the most favorite thing for her was spring. In the garden she would go. She had me till her garden. She would watch me every step I took. She would make sure I did not till any of her special plants. One year we found a mulberry tree. She got so excited you'd have thought she hit the lottery. She had me go to the home and get sheets to put underneath the tree to catch the berries. Then she said, "Get up in that tree and shake it." Huh? Me? I don't climb trees. Up I went. We got a great many berries, and that's when she taught me how to make jellies. Oh my gosh, I got started and made all kinds of jellies. She taught me to take the peel of the apple and boil it, and that juice was made to make your jellies. Of course, the apples, we made pies, fillings, apple juice, applesauce, you name it, we did it. She was funny. We would get up early in the morning, pick up all the apples that fell or was knocked down during the night, cut out the bad spots, and that's where we made the apple pie filling or the sauces or the juice. At night she would heat a brick on top of the stove and put it at the foot of her bed to keep her warm. She kept her coffee cup on top of the warm morning heater so it would stay hot. She made some of the most beautiful quilts. She would save old clothes and cut them into pieces as she needed for the quilt. It was funny. She had stacks and stacks of clothes in her house for cutting. There was a path from one room to the other. She taught me how to make quilts. My family has been gathering and hunting for as long as I can remember. It has been a life I would not change. I think if we don't talk to the older generation to gather the knowledge they have, it will be gone forever. There may come a time in either my life or the next young generation will need this information and it will be gone. Take the time to share the information and knowledge you have with the younger generation if you can.